Welcome back to Good Law, Bad Law. You know, Greta Thunberg is Time Magazine's Person of the Year, and well, she should be, as one of the youth leaders of hundreds of thousands and millions of young people taking to the streets to raise awareness of the issue of climate change. While she and many, many others are engaging in climate strikes and protests, some climate activists and just ordinary folks whose lives have been deeply affected by climate change are taking to the courts. And so on today's episode, we are discussing just that, how climate change is being fought in the courts from the West Coast to the East Coast and in between as well, with my guest, Sid Shapiro. He's a law professor at Wake Forest University Law School in North Carolina and has written a really fascinating article looking at the role of tort law, that is civil law, civil cases brought by citizens and businesses and fishermen and neighbors to CAFOs, these large pork operations in North Carolina, bringing lawsuits to hold accountable those who have caused and created the harms that they're experiencing, that we now call the big name climate change. But we're seeing this play out in courts more and more, and we will see it more and more as the years go forward. So very important and really fun and fascinating and important issue. My conversation with Sid Shapiro on this episode of Good Law, Bad Law. Stay tuned. On today's episode of Good Law, Bad Law, we are talking again about climate change, a subject of great interest to me on this program and, of course, great importance in the world. Also, again, a very timely topic as Time Magazine has named Greta Thunberg, the youth climate activist who's really rallied a world of young people to the issue of climate change this year. Time named her its Person of the Year in the current issue of Time Magazine. And with me on the program today is an expert in the issue of not just climate, but the role of the courts and plaintiffs, citizen plaintiffs bringing lawsuits against those responsible for the harms of climate change in courts. And to talk about climate litigation as one of the forefronts of the fight to improve our globe's status in the face of enormous climate change crises, is my guest today, Sidney Shapiro. Sid, thank you so much for being on Good Law, Bad Law today.
Aaron, thank you for having me. I do appreciate the invitation. It's a terribly important topic, and I'm glad we have the opportunity to discuss it.
And of course it is, and there are a number of ways in which the profile of the issue of climate change has been elevated, it seems, almost overnight. In the last year, we have been talking about the Green New Deal. We have seen climate strikes with young people led by students and young people like Greta Thunberg, like my own daughter, Olivia, who's working out of Boston on issues of motivating and rallying young people to the issue of climate change. And we've seen candidates this year talking about climate in debates really for the first time. I don't think that happened at all 4 years ago. So there has been a lot of change, and but we're going to focus on the kind of change that can come about through action in court. And this is something that you and a number of other of your colleagues at the Center for Progressive Reform have written about in a recent article that is fascinating. So if you would, Sid, give us a little background on yourself and tell us a little bit about the Center for Progressive Reform and this article that you've pulled together. And then we'll get into some of the details of this great issue.
I'm a law professor at Wake Forest University in Winston-Salem, North Carolina, and I've been there 9 years. No, 14 years. Boy, time flies. Sorry. And before that, I did the same thing. I was a law professor at the University of Kansas.
Mm-hmm.
Some years ago, myself and 4 other law professors decided that we wanted to try to influence public policy in ways that were different than simply doing what professors do, which is to write articles and teach students. And that's important, certainly. But we were looking for additional ways. And so we founded an organization called the Center for Progressive Reform, or CPR for short. We have a good website with lots of blogs and information, and the type of report which Aaron just mentioned, which is on litigation and climate change. And we'll talk more about that in a second. Readers need to search for the Center for Progressive Reform. Unfortunately or fortunately, if you search for CPR, you're going to get good instructions on how to save someone's life if they're having a heart attack,
which is
but
useful.
You won't get our organization. One of the reasons that we founded the organization, and there were several, was that tort law, using litigation not only to help people recover when they've been damaged, but to foster necessary social and sometimes economic changes, has gotten a really bad rap. And that's because the people on the other side, large corporations, big law firms, they've engaged in a fairly successful public relations campaign to demean tort law and what it can accomplish. And one of the reasons we founded CPR was those kinds of messages weren't being responded to very well, at least in our opinion, all the time. And so we thought maybe as professors and people who've thought about these issues, we could engage in some pushback and try to bring interested readers and listeners a truer account of how things like tort law and law in general work for social progress.
Well, and Sid, as a tort lawyer for my entire legal career, as a trial lawyer, bringing cases, the little guy against the big corporation, I know firsthand from the last quarter century that what you just said is so true, both in terms of the change that can happen, not only to an individual's life in bringing a civil case to hold somebody accountable for some wrongdoing, but also going beyond the experience of that individual who brings the case to bring about greater and wider change, changes in policy, changes in practices, changes in awareness of an issue. And all that can be accomplished in court. And of course, the interests that we're challenging, as you say, big companies, big health systems, insurance companies, they have a very strong interest in communicating a very different message. But we're going to focus on the message of the climate litigators, as you call them in the article. And for people for whom this may not be basic and readily already known, just describe for us generally, and then I do want to get into some of the specific case studies that you take on. What are we talking about when we talk about on the issue of climate, tort cases that are brought in court on this issue? What does that even mean? What are we talking about?
Sure. Before I answer that, in order to have your listeners better understand what I would say, I need to take one step back. When we say that tort law gets a bad rap, we mean that there are a lot of stories out there and claims about tort law that simply aren't true. They're just serving the interests of those people who have done bad things and don't want to get sued. But there is one aspect of this which is true to an extent about the limitations of tort law. And it's this, that in the 1950s actually, and before, particularly when it came to issues regarding environmental protection, we only had tort law. And it does have its limitations as to how successful it can be as a vehicle for protecting people from environmental damage and the environment itself. And these are fairly significant, truth be told. So what Congress realized in the 1960s is if we were going to make progress and start to clean up our air and our water and protect ourselves against toxic chemicals, so on and so forth, we really needed to do that by regulation because regulatory agencies are much more effective or can be much more effective in creating the kinds of protections that people in the environment need. And I think that's largely true. What that statement doesn't take into account is that we also know now, based on experience, that regulatory agencies can become captured. And by captured, I mean they're unduly influenced by the very industries that they are supposed to regulate. And when that happens, the regulators simply don't do their job at all, and people and the environment don't get protected. And when that happens, the civil justice system, tort law, is a very important backup and supplement to the regulatory system. And there's a number of reasons for that. The first is the regulators aren't doing their job, and tort law can come in behind them and help people. And the second is that if you didn't have tort law, that wouldn't get done, and then we wouldn't get protected at all. So in that vein, it's important to keep tort law robust and have it available as we need it.
Well, let me
That's
just
true, obviously, of climate change.
Well, let me add something to that. Let me add something to that, Sid, from my own experience, because because I think what you said is so important to underscore, and I can bring some personal experience to that, which is great that we have regulations. I mean, the 1970s saw an explosion of environmental regulations. President Nixon, of all people, creating the Environmental Protection Agency. And I've done a lot of environmental litigation involving contaminated sites and toxic waste and things of that nature. So regulations are great for looking forward and trying to get companies and businesses to comply with certain standards on a going forward basis. But tort litigation, it seems to me, is a means to hold a wrongdoer accountable for something that happened in the past. The regulations typically don't provide any kind of relief to an individual or to a company, let's say, that has been injured by a wrongdoer because of, say, dumping toxic waste out in the back 40, and causing some harm because of that. Tort law or civil law, the other aspect of it that I think you alluded to is, unlike regulatory agencies like the EPA and others that have an influence over the environment, which can be, as you say, captured, because of political appointments, can be, you can have former coal executives, for instance, put in charge of regulation of the coal industry. that happens. But that really can't happen in the same way in a civil lawsuit in court, because ultimately the decider is a jury of fellow citizens. And I often feel when I try to explain this to clients that you are on a fairly equal playing field with even the largest chemical company or even the United States government itself in court in a way you could never be on an equal playing field when you're in Washington, D.C., because you don't have the money to hire a big lobbyist, or you don't have the ability to get in and sit down with a member of Congress or head of an agency. So, I mean, tort law, I think, is really important for those reasons, too.
I couldn't agree more.
So Sid, let's then take those kind of working, ideas and values in terms of climate, because that's the subject that you and some of your colleagues explore in this really great paper. And by the way, we'll put a link to this so people will be able to find it easily. If you want to look up how to resuscitate a patient after a heart attack, I think people should be encouraged to do that. But if you want to read this great article, we'll make sure it's easy for people to find. But why is it and how is it that the tort law, that the civil law, can be used to bring about change on the issue of climate change?
The litigants who have brought these climate lawsuits, with the exception of the young person's lawsuit, which we can talk about, are states and cities, and they are incurring significant additional costs as a result of the failure of the energy industry to admit what they recognized, which is that climate change is real and will bring substantial changes in weather, tides, and other effects, which are going to adversely affect literally millions of people.
Yeah, and in looking through some of the background on this, it seems one of the points that you make that's crucial to this explosion of lawsuits of all different types around the country and all kinds of different courts around the country is the uncovering of evidence that many of the giant companies in the fossil fuel business have known about the dangers, the risks, and the harms that can result from the promoting and wide use of fossil fuel products. And so the uncovering of because you might say some people, some activists, some scholars have known about the risks of climate change for decades, but it seems like it's in only very recent years that the kind of information that can be the basis for bringing a legal claim against some of the companies responsible has become available that makes these lawsuits possible. How can you say a bit more about that?
Yes. We're gradually learning that, and in part that's because some of that information just has become publicly available. But as these lawsuits proceed, and the defendants are trying to stop them, if they proceed, one of the ancillary benefits of tort law as this supplement and important backup, besides all the ones we discussed earlier, is that it can ferret out this information and even make it public. That was famously one of the great impacts of the tobacco litigation when states took on suing the tobacco companies. And through discovery, they were able to show and make public that the tobacco companies knew for a very long time that their products were killing people. And in fact, they were taking actions in terms of the manufacture of those products, which made that result even worse. And the same thing here, although these lawsuits were brought for the reasons that you and I were discussing earlier, one of the benefits that we could get from them is also to understand the full culpability of the energy companies in not warning people that these important climate changes were coming down the road. Warnings that could have been used to way earlier to mitigate some of the adverse impacts.
You know, that you raised such a great point and analogizing to the tobacco industry. And again, it was no secret that cigarette smoking was harmful to health. I mean, the Surgeon General made that announcement in the late 1960s, but it was only until really very recent years, maybe a decade ago, no more, that lawsuits against the tobacco companies started producing real results in court, ultimately resulting in, multi-billion-dollar settlements with the tobacco industry. And I mean, it just reminds me of another example too, that with Roundup, we've seen a spate of Roundup cases. I can say from firsthand experience, and it's somewhat embarrassing to admit, but I was approached by a potential client probably 15 years ago who claimed that he had developed cancer from exposure to Roundup, and he worked at a golf course. So he was somebody who was exposed occupationally. And I looked around at the science at the time, and I didn't see how we were going to be able to make that case work with the evidence and the science that we were going to need to put it together. But because some enterprising lawyers and their clients in more recent years did take on the manufacturer of Roundup, they were able to get documents through the case that have helped win those cases. And ultimately, looks like those also will be resolved ultimately with very significant payouts to the people who developed cancer, and with significant, I would think, deterring effect to the manufacturers that they shouldn't be putting such a dangerous product out there. So just another example, and here we have climate now, the fossil fuel companies, who we have a lot more evidence in recent years than ever, and through these lawsuits, as you point out, hopefully even more evidence will be developed to be able to demonstrate the validity of these claims, and hopefully to bring relief to some of the people who've been injured. That's one of the great things about the process.
There's another group of potential defendants who are out there who may well be culpable. And those are companies, large industrial facilities mainly, that have failed to take protective actions against the possibility of climate-induced weather changes, making them more vulnerable to flooding, to high winds, and if in fact they are causing that damage occurs, then there's a possibility, since the regulators aren't doing it, that tort lawyers can move in and represent cities and even individuals who were damaged by this. So I'm thinking, if you remember when Houston flooded the last time, horrible floods, there were any number of chemical facilities located along rivers that flooded, and the floodwaters became highly contaminated, it appears, from overrunning those chemical facilities, and then that water all washed out over other people's lands, into the sewer systems, and no doubt probably caused significant damage down the road. That's the kind of failure to take reasonable precautions that tort law can look at and do something about.
Well, I'll give you another one too. From I was just out in San Francisco over Thanksgiving visiting my parents and my sister and her family. And as probably many people have seen on the news, California has been devastated in the last several years with widespread fires, taking a lot of homes. I mean, even the Reagan Presidential Library in Southern California came within a few dozen feet of one of these raging fires. Because of climate change, it is well thought that there are much drier conditions. There hasn't been consistent rain when we expect there to be rain, and so you have very dry conditions in some parts of the state, and then you add in high winds, and you add then the power lines from the electrical utility in California, PG&E, which has been talking about putting its power lines in vulnerable areas of the state underground for 2 decades, but hasn't done so. And that is seen as a really sort of toxic combination that has contributed greatly. And there are now varying lawsuits in California to hold PG&E accountable for its past failures to anticipate and deal with this problem that they knew about, but really also to pressure them through these cases to do the right thing going forward. And again, as you say, the regulatory agencies aren't doing that. It's really change that's coming about because of pressure from citizens bringing cases in court.
That's why we refer to tort law as this important backup and supplement. And all of these examples, I think, really do establish that.
Yeah. And now you kind of do as a case study a few of the currently pending cases. You mentioned the youth activist case, which we've talked about on this podcast, 21 young climate activists who brought this sort of sweeping indictment of the entire fossil fuel industry for its role in climate change in a federal court out on the West Coast. But I'm fascinated too, because those do get a fair amount of attention. But I'm fascinated by a couple of the kinds of cases that you highlight in your report, because they're perhaps less sweeping in their scope. You know, all fossil fuel companies responsible for all harms to the planet. You know, and that's a lot to bite off and chew on in one single case. But you focus on some cases that have a much more focused, a much more refined focus to them. And I think that's also important to understand about both the impacts that climate change is having and is going to have, and ways in which our tort system in court can be one way of addressing them. Do you want to say a few words about the case involving the cottage industry fishermen, for example? Because I think that's a great example of the type of case I think we're going to see more and more of.
Absolutely. So earlier, both you and I were discussing that tort law does some things very well, things that the regulatory system cannot do, especially compensating people for harms that have been caused them by unreasonable actions by others. But it also may not be as good in many instances as having an effective regulatory system. So that's important too. And when we start talking about climate change and we're talking about the young person's lawsuit, that's a pretty good example. The sort of classic tort case is an automobile accident or my neighbor coming up and for no good reason hitting me over the head and harming me. And tort law can sort that out. They can juries can figure out who's at fault. They can determine whether or not the defendant, in fact, caused the plaintiff his or her injuries. And the lawsuits are a little more straightforward. But when we get to climate change itself, and the contributions of the energy industry to climate change, there's no doubt they're there. I mean, the science now is incontrovertible, but it's hard to trace through. We have multiple energy companies. People use their products, and that also contributes to climate change. And then the effects of climate change occur all over the world. These impacts work through our natural environment in different ways. And it's classically very difficult to sort all those complications out in a lawsuit. And regulation is generally the preferable way to try to do that. But we're now seeing, such as the lawsuit you mentioned, lawsuits that are much more like the classic tort lawsuit, and ones that the tort system handles quite well, thank you. And so in the one we're discussing, there was a group of farmers that were looking at a defendant over time that simply failed to take into account the actions of climate change, the impacts of climate change, and they were able to establish eventually, because the science now is good enough, how that defendant contributed to their harms through the mechanism of climate change.
Mm-hmm. And specifically, this case of the fishermen, I'm just looking at your article that describes this case. These were really small, sort of a group or loose collective of small fishing and often family fishing businesses, particularly crabbers in the Pacific Northwest. In fact, again, I heard when I was out in San Francisco a couple weeks ago that the Dungeness crab season, which is a big deal out west, is delayed this year because of changes in climate and extra protections they've had to take for the crab, the crab in the ocean where they fish and farm for these crabs. That because of overheating of the water along the coast, where these fishermen get the crabs, that this has really harmed their business, millions and millions of dollars in lost revenue to these significant number of fishermen and fisheries, both looking for the wild crabs, but also those that are raising in sort of controlled environments, everything from clams to crabs and other, edible products of the sea, that their businesses have been substantially harmed. So I guess a question I have about that, which you touched on, is the classic formulation of any tort case, whether it's a car accident or a case like this, is you have to have some party, some company or individual that did something wrong, and then you have to prove that that wrongful conduct was the cause of your harm. And I guess that's the question in a case like this, which, as you say, is so enormously complicated. How is the causation part of these cases really the challenge, do you think? The wrongful conduct part seems to be something we can wrap our arms around much more readily in 2019, but the cause part, linking the wrongful conduct to the specific harm in question, that would seem to be the big challenge here.
That's true, and the change which we talk about, or the development, should I say, that we talk about in the report is that what we call attribution science is greatly improving. So we all know about the science of climate change, and the scientific reports now widely accepted that greenhouse gases, the increase in greenhouse gases, is causing climate change. This is man-made, and it does exist despite the deniers. But as we were talking about earlier, there are lots of causes of that, and people up and down who've contributed to it, so on and so forth. And so, can you trace their actions to your harm? So, taking the instance of these crab fishers, the problem is the sea is warming, and that is harmful to the wildlife that grows there, the crabs that they harvest, and as a result, they've been adversely affected. What the attribution science is starting to be able to show is that the fossil fuel companies have contributed to climate change by selling their products. B, that has led to an increase in the temperatures of the seas. C, that one of the areas where that is occurring is, in fact, where these people work and try to earn a living, and that one of the changes that it causes is these things called algae blooms, which are toxic materials that grow in warm water, and that's deadly to these crabs. So that is a linkage, but it's a fairly straightforward linkage once you get down to it, or at least it's much more straightforward than some of the other climate lawsuits have had to prove.
Well, and there are principles of establishing liability or accountability where there are multiple defendants contributing to a harm, but it's difficult to sort out exactly which defendant caused which percentage of the harm. There are ways that our tort law can deal with that kind of situation. We've seen that in asbestos litigation. We've seen that in other types of litigation of this type where you say, okay, there's a lot of fossil fuel companies, a lot of big ones, Exxon, Shell, Chevron, BP. I mean, how do we know that it was Shell and not Exxon that in that particular location caused the water temperature to rise, that caused an algae bloom that harmed the Dungeness crab pup? You know, how do we make that specific link? And there are ways that the law can deal with that in looking at an industry and sort of apportioning responsibility. But that is a challenge.
It is a challenge, but consider the alternative. So this law of joint and several liability, which you're discussing, was developed in part dealing with places like lakes and land that are toxic. Lots of toxic chemicals are in these areas, and since there were several chemical companies in the area that has despoiled the land or despoiled the water, it's hard to tell, whose poison you're drinking. If we didn't assign on a fair basis responsibility to all the companies, then we're allowing them to get away with it, if you will, because they've managed to harm other people in a way that it is difficult to sort out precisely and exactly who they've harmed. Although we know as a total, all of them have contributed it to people becoming sick, ill, getting cancer, so on and so forth. So it's very important that tort law not let people off the hook just because there might be 4, 5, 6, or even 20 defendants, all of whom have caused the particular algae blooms that we were discussing in this area.
Right. That's absolutely true. And we've seen that over the last 50 years as through the regulatory process, contaminated sites, like you said, Lake Erie, many Superfund landfill sites that were places where many companies dumped many horrible toxic and dangerous things, there is a system for holding them accountable for the cleanup and the restoration of the water or the land or the riverway. And as you say, tort law has a way of dealing with that as well. I'm wondering, we've mentioned a couple of other kinds of very historic groups of litigation. We mentioned the tobacco litigation, we mentioned the Roundup litigation. All of them, it seems, needed to find their moment. I'm going to make a very bad pun here. The climate had to be right in a certain sense for those cases to gain traction, ultimately to, achieve the potential that they had to not only, bring some relief, bring some financial compensation to the injured people, sometimes many thousands or more injured people, but also to bring about a kind of change going forward. The Ford Pinto case, so many other examples we can talk about. Do you think there's something now about the climate, again, bad pun, climate we're in today, that means we can look forward to even more of the kinds of cases that we've been talking about, like with the fishermen in the Pacific Northwest? Is there something about greater awareness and maybe what impact that has on juries or on judges who will be hearing these cases? Is there something about the climate we now are in that we should see more of these cases going forward, do you think?
Yes, by all means, in a couple of ways. One, the regulatory system is so obviously broke that there's no question about the need for tort law to try to help people and do something. If the regulatory system were operating and we were quibbling over whether to do this regulation or that regulation, or make this one stronger and that one weaker, then, although imperfect, the regulatory system at least would be there trying to help people. But it is so obviously broken for the moment that I think people welcome action on this. Then more broadly, I think just the rising awareness that we haven't got many years left to start to recognize and deal with this problem, or the lives of some of us, and certainly our children and grandchildren, are going to be profoundly changed. And I think almost everyone's aware of that, except the people who opportunistically, like the president, choose to deny it for political reasons.
Well, and you have a number of recommendations, Sid, at the end of your report, one of which is that Congress, state legislatures, and state courts should not restrict or limit climate torts. And again, from my own experience, having been a trial lawyer for the last more than 20 years, I'm very sensitive and interested in that issue as well, because we've seen that through legislation, the powerful interests that we were talking about earlier, the insurance industry, the Chamber of Commerce on behalf of big corporations, can lobby on the federal level or on the state level to pass certain laws that would restrict the rights of citizens to bring these kinds of cases. And so if you are thinking about participating in the political process as we come upon a national election year in 2020, I think you'd have to say this is something, if you care about the climate, and we hear some criticism of people who say, well, they're protesting, but what are they protesting for? This is something you can actually pay very specific attention to when you're evaluating which candidate you should support. Who is this person likely to appoint to head the new EPA? Will that be someone from the energy industry, or will that be somebody who's more focused on the interests of, citizens and the effects of climate change? These are the kinds of things that people can become informed about as they're thinking about who should earn their vote. And I, just add my vote and say I urge people to do that, because there's both great opportunity in the kinds of things we've been talking about, but there's also opportunity for powerful interest to, build walls to protect against these kinds of changes taking place.
Unfortunately, yes, and there's lots of evidence that they've been successful in doing that in the past. Once an industry or a group of industries realizes that they may be vulnerable because, in fact, they have engaged in unreasonable behavior, they certainly can hire lawyers to represent them in court, and that's their right to do so. That's how our system works. But at the same time, it may be convenient just to get rid of the lawsuits by going to legislators to whom they donate lots of money and making up an excuse as to why these tort lawsuits are vexatious and unfair and bad for business, so on and so forth. And unfortunately, that has worked in the past. There's lots of evidence of limitations on tort lawsuits in lots of areas, particularly medical malpractice. And in particular in the states, because in many states, legislators are not terribly well informed, particularly about that subject. The legislature has gone along. In the state in which I live, North Carolina, there's a pending lawsuit right now against literally the largest pork producer in North Carolina because it is arranged with large feeding lots called CAFOs, or concentrated animal feeding operations, to grow pigs for it. But what the plaintiff in the lawsuit, the plaintiffs have been able to show is that these individual farms are not taking state-of-the-art protections against polluting their neighbors, the kinds of protections that CAFOs in other states are actually using.
Right, so they're not handling the waste. Yeah.
Right. So the reaction of the pork industry in North Carolina was to go to the legislature and get them to pass a law which bars all similar future lawsuits.
Incredible.
And they even tried to bar this one retroactively, except that didn't work. So that's a kind of simple example. And as we see more of these climate lawsuits, particularly if they start to have some success, I think there's very little doubt that we can expect the energy companies to go to Congress or states and try to get themselves exempted from these kinds of lawsuits.
Anytime you hear the phrase tort reform, folks who are listening, it is not actually tort reform. That is Orwell speak for insurance company protection, usually, or some corporate industry protection law. I've no doubt that the CAFO industry in North Carolina probably called that law in the State House something along the lines of a tort reform kind of bill, but clearly it's not a reform. It's a measure to offer protection to an industry, so that cases like the one you mentioned can't force them to be accountable for the harms that they bring about. So be very wary of the phrase tort reform if you ever hear that. Run fast in the other direction. Well, this is fascinating, Sid, and there's so much. I think it's. I think we gave some pretty good examples so that people, as you're following the news and following what's going on in your local communities or in your states, can be more attuned to the kinds of ways in which citizens and family businesses that are affected by others that have really been the main causes of climate change can be held accountable and can be turned to face in a direction that's facing more towards progress and trying to do something about this. So whether it's CAFOs in North Carolina or forest fires in California or crabbers in the Pacific Northwest, and so many other examples that we could talk about. Again, we'll put a link up, Sid, to your article. Make sure that people can get that. I think it's really worth everybody reading and taking a look at. And thank you, Sidney Shapiro from Wake Forest Law School in North Carolina and the Center for Progressive Reform. I really appreciate it a lot. Thank you.